Hi, and welcome to another edition of Studio 411. I'm your host, Larry De Silva. Got to be very careful today. We've got a show for the ages. Not only that, but I also have to make sure I don't confuse the name of our show with the name of the famous club that we're going to be talking about. So this is Studio 411, much drabber than our subject matter today, which is the infamous club in Manhattan from the 70s and 80s, Studio 54. We have a gentleman who has written a book that details the story of sex, drugs, rock and roll, and much more. Mark Fleishman. The book's called Inside Studio 54, published by Rare Bird Books. For more information, rarebirdbooks.com. Say that 3 times. And without further ado, we welcome Mark Fleishman. Mark, thanks for being on the program. How are you?
Thanks for having me. I'm fine, and looking forward to the show.
Now, tell me, obviously, I always ask this question of authors, but what inspired you at this point in your life to write the book?
Well, I guess I was down in Rancho La Puerta, where I used to, in the book, Rancho La Puerta is where I gained my total sobriety after the Studio 54 experience. But it's a fitness spa, and I was down there for a week. I brought the bar method there. We'll be talking about that, I guess. And sitting at a table with a bunch of strangers, and people started saying, how many years have you been coming here? And I said, I've been coming here since 1987. What do you like about it? And I told them I had a magical experience on a mountaintop where I had really sort of lost my mojo, and I got it back. And people started saying, well, what a fabulous story that is. I told them about Studio 54 and how I took in the good life and overdid it and abused drugs and alcohol, and I went to Betty Ford, and that was okay, but it detoxed me, but it didn't send me on the rest of my journey through life. And Rancho La Puerta did, and I started telling people about it, and people started saying, well, you got to write a book. This is a fabulous story. And I thought about it, and I went back to my villa, and I was in the process of reading Teddy Kennedy's autobiography, and I saw how he laid it out. And so I laid my life out on paper, early years, middle years, later years, and what brought me to what. And not that much of that ever got used, but anyway, I outlined a book, and I was at Rancho La Puerta, and that's the place where I seem to be inspired to keep writing. So I've been going back there many times,
and it's certainly a bearing your soul, to say the least.
Well, I certainly did.
Yeah, absolutely. For those, again, tuning in, Mark Fleishman, former owner of Studio 54, and just to give you a little chronology, Mark actually was kind of a second-generation owner, bought the club when the original owners, back in the late 70s, early 80s, did some time in prison for tax evasion, and he successfully ran the club until late 1984, when, as he said, for many reasons, decided to move on from that. And I think you'll get a better picture of why, not only the good times, but the bad times that are featured in the book. Reading the book, I found you were fascinated by the nightclub scene from the time you were about 10 years old. Tell us, your parents kind of exposed you to a couple of the famous clubs back in the day in the late 40s, early 50s.
Well, as I explained in the book, I started to wonder why I went to such extremes to buy the club, because I had to go to federal prison to visit these guys, and there was a time that, as I explained in the book, their lawyer was Roy Cohn, who's famous now because he was Donald Trump's lawyer, and he had me meet him one day on a Tuesday, and there's no visiting days on a Tuesday, and I said, Roy, what are we doing here? He said, if you want to own Studio 54, just do what I say. And he handed me a card saying, Mark Fleishman, attorney at law. And I wasn't an attorney. And I showed it to the reception guards, and they let me in, of course. I went with Roy, and we finished the negotiations in federal prison. But what I said in the book is, what in the world caused me to take a chance to impersonate an attorney in federal prison, and why did I want to buy Studio 54 so badly? And I thought about it very carefully on my mountaintop retreat, and realized that I really always had this vision of being a nightclub owner, a major club where everybody dressed up to the nines and came. And of course, they didn't dress that way in the old days, but when I was 10 years old, my parents took me to the Copa one day, Copacabana, which was the hot club in New York, and I just ate it up. I loved it. The scene was unbelievable, and Copa girls and fabulous women who dressed up guys. Bar scene was amazing. The scene on the dance floor was amazing. And I got very excited. And then I saw a couple of movies that I really loved. And one was Casablanca and Rick's Cafe, and Rick, the Humphrey Bogart character. And I just sort of envisioned myself running a big, wonderful nightclub. And I ended up going to the Cornell School of Hotel Administration and taking over bankrupt hotels, and which is a far more lucrative business and safer than nightclubs. But somehow I owned a hotel in St. Thomas, and one thing led to another, and I wanted a Studio 54 there. And I contacted Steve Rubel and Ian Schrager, and Schrager came down once, and at first they weren't interested, and then once we were in jail, and they were in jail, they said, let's do our deal. So I opened the Studio 54 in St. Thomas. So one thing led to another, and it started when I was 10 years old at the Copa, and I when Studio 54 opened, it was just an amazing experience that I had as a patron. And then I wanted to buy it.
And you talk about how, you felt that these things that happened in your life, even through the bad times later on, but especially leading up to when you owned the club, that it was kind of almost, you could see almost a pattern, like almost it was predestined that you eventually were to, own this club and almost like fulfill kind of a dream that you had, which is exactly what you just stated.
Yes, it's exactly right. I wanted to own that club. The dream was suppressed in my mind, and I was on to other things. And then I took over this bankrupt Virgin Isle Hilton Hotel, which was closed, and reopened it and started to put in all kinds of features that would attract people. And that's when I decided I wanted a Studio 54 there. And at first they weren't interested because they were out of their minds also at the time, and very successful. And then once they were in jail, they saw that that was the only option. And so I was going to open another club there, and they said, let's do Studio 54. And I said, of course. And then I wanted to buy Studio 54 in New York from them, and I did. And the State Liquor Authority and the Alcoholic Beverage Commission tried as hard as they could not to process my license application. And as hard as they tried, I kept getting a new lawyer and putting pressure on them and threatening to sue for my constitutional rights as an American citizen. And they gave in one day, and they processed it, and I got a liquor license and opened.
There you go.
A year and a half.
As you well know, a lot of clubs aren't going to make it without a liquor license. No matter.
They tried for about 10 days. They were in jail, and the license was pulled, and they tried to do juice and and drugs and whatever, and it didn't work.
Exactly.
People want liquor at a club.
Mark Fleishman joining us, author of Inside Studio 54, published by Rare Bird Books. For more information, rarebirdbooks.com. You talk about a little in the book. I was thinking that even before I got to that point in one of the chapters, how do you think a Studio 54 would play today? Because you and I were on the same page with cell phones and social media and just the TMZs of the world. I don't know. How would you mentioned confiscating phones? I mean, other than newspaper photographers that were allowed in, how would something like this club play today?
Well, I'm not sure. I have a sense that it wouldn't be quite the same because of social media. People seem to have their own thing, and Studio 54 was a gathering place where famous people came, and then normal civilians wanted to be in the room with the famous people. And so, but everybody knew that Studio 54 was it. And these days now there are alternatives, and you can read about it in social media. And everything's moving so fast that I'm just not sure of what would happen. It could be the club was the best club in the world, and the most exciting, and the visual effects, and the people, but the people made the scene, and without the celebrities there, I'm not sure that it would be quite the same, and I wouldn't try it. I'll tell you that.
Tell me a little bit about, you grew up in Great Neck, Long Island, and as a young to middle teen, I was very impressed back, and I would have said would have been, what, the mid to late 50s. You spent a lot of time venturing into Harlem to check out the venues and clubs back then. How did those experiences inspire you in your later pursuit of not only running hotels, but eventually Studio 54?
Well, the music scene in Harlem was the thing that caught me, and when I got to Studio 54, they were playing old disco, and I loved R&B music that I used to hear at a place called Small's Paradise in Harlem, which was the place, owned by Will Chamberlain at one point in life. And in the 40s and 50s and the early 60s, I guess, it was on 125th Street and Amsterdam Avenue, or a place where white folks didn't go very easily. But I used to park right in front and run right in, and everybody was very friendly. It was wonderful, and I really got into the sexy kind of dancing that you dance to R&B music, and I made Studio 54 more R&B oriented than disco oriented, and I'm still into R&B.
But you would admit, by '81, disco, for any number of reasons, I think it was almost self-demolished. But it kind of started to phase out. I mean, it continued as dance music, but the word disco started to, I don't know, take a bad connotation. So I think it was kind of moving into techno or punk or more R&B, or that sound that the '80s came out with. So I think that was a good move on your part to kind of veer away a little bit from that at that point.
Absolutely, it was necessary.
Yeah.
The press, not that disco music was wrong, because disco music is great, and people dance to it easily, and the beat really gets people, and they're still playing it today.
Sure. We've got a shot here on the monitor, left to right. I know 4 of the 5 individuals: Christopher Reeve, the late Superman actor; Dodi Fayed, second from left. Next to him, Eliza Minnelli, and the gentleman on the far end, Halston. I was very impressed. I did not know of really Dodi Fayed until, of course, the mid-'90s, when he became involved with the late Princess Diana. And of course, they were killed in that tragic auto accident over 20 years ago. But Dodi was quite a player back in those days with not only Steve and Ian, but also during your time there.
Yeah, he made a movie, I guess financed by his father, but it was Chariots of Fire, which won an Academy Award. And all of a sudden, he became hot, and celebrities started to hang out with him, and he was talking to Eliza about making another movie that she'd be in, and it never happened. But he was hot, and he had a private plane, and
he partied hard, from what I could see. As did many of the folks that went to Studio 54. They certainly maximized their time at the club, I can tell you that.
They lived hard.
Yes, sir. Yeah. And
everybody stayed up all night and drinking and drugs, and finally Valium to go to sleep, which is what did me in finally. But Dodi was fun. And I spent a lot of time with him and flew on his private plane to Miami. He had a great condo there at the Turnberry Club.
Now, you had an earlier experience in the '60s. You had taken over a nightclub that you renamed the Candy Store. I don't remember the club per se. I remember one of the people that you featured as a dancer. I remember her from the old Beach Party movies, a marvelous dancer named Candy Johnson, and that kind of gave you not only an experience, I gathered, to running a club, but also you had some interesting dealings with the mob bosses.
I did, and that was sort of an accident, but it wasn't open for very long because of the mob. But Candy Johnson was. She was the shimmy girl in the beach party movies, Beach Blanket Bingo and Beach Party, and with Annette Funicello and Frankie Avalon. And she was staying in a hotel that I had taken over called the Forest Hills Inn in Queens. And it was right by the World's Fair, and she was performing at the World's Fair, and then the World's Fair ended in October '64, I guess. And they didn't know what they were going to do, and I said, let's do a club in New York. And we named it after her, the Candy Store, and took over an empty room over a club called the Discoteco Go-Go, or something like that. And I thought it was owned by a particular man who owned beauty salons, and I met him at the Copacabana, just hanging out, and it turned out that it was owned by the mob, and we made a deal in writing, and I had my lawyer, and we did it exactly right, and then one day they came and said, we want to change the deal. And they wanted to take her over, and they wanted to take me over, and they wanted to make me president of a hotel in Las Vegas, and I just got so scared, and I just didn't want to be owned by them, and so I stopped funding the band, and we moved them off to Spain, where I had spent time in the University of Madrid going to learning Spanish, and we moved out, and they closed, and that was the end of the candy store.
Here you go. Mark Fleishman, Inside Studio 54, published by Rare Bird Books. For more information, rarebirdbooks.com. A quote from one of a longtime, I'm sure, acquaintances from back in the day. Quote, Fleischman's retelling of stories about the famous and not so famous cast of characters that made up Studio 54 made it so much fun that it'll tickle your fancy for wild nights that last until dawn. And that was from Robin Leach, Las Vegas Review-Journal, and many of you know him, a former host of Lifestyle of the Rich and Famous. I wish I could do his voice, but I can't. Here's an image that I was admiring when we were setting up for the interview. Photo of Reggie Jackson at the time in his late career with the Yankees. I'm told this was a shot taken actually after they lost Game 6 of the '81 World Series. He looks a little dejected, but he's certainly surrounded by enough pretty girls that I'm sure he drowned his sorrows.
I remember that night well, and it didn't seem like he cared at all.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, cared about being there or cared about that they lost?
Cared about losing.
Wow. Well, he didn't lose too much, but that was a tough series, as most of us that were around then remembered. Now, let's see, the location that I was fascinated of, the club, Studio 54, had between 1943 and 1976 had been owned by CBS Television. And I was amazed. I don't know if you even knew this, but shows like Password, What's My Line, To Tell the Truth, shows that a lot of us grew up with that are old enough to remember, and you can even see them now on some of the syndicated game shows.
I had heard that. Even Captain Kangaroo.
Oh, really? Wow, you bounced the captain. Oh, my goodness. My God, I wonder, did you guys ever feel there were any ghosts, like ghosts of Dorothy Kilgallen or Bud Collyer haunting in that place?
Never even dreamed of it.
No, that was...
What happened is CBS stopped filming there in early 70s, and they put it on the market, and then Steve Rubell and Ian Schrager saw it, and they thought they could create a club out of it, and they did. And it was an amazing thing, taking a space that 25, how many, I forgot how many square feet.
Oh, it was pretty big, because you had quite an array of seating.
Square feet.
Absolutely. I was just looking.
Several floors.
Just to, again, this list is, I could go on and do an entire 2 hours of just some of the people that appeared in the club during its history, during Mark's time, as well as when the prior owners. Just to run off a few. Actually, we have a shot here of Steve Rubell and a very young Michael Jackson. And Michael, we're going to see him crop up several times. He was shy, but certainly came into his own, spending quite a bit of time, it seemed like, at Studio 54.
Michael was there often.
Yeah.
He used to love it.
Yeah, and that's...
And we used to, we had a screen that would come down, and it was, the music was synced on the DJ booth to play him singing, but Thriller, I guess you must remember Thriller.
Absolutely, yes. I vaguely recall. One of the biggest selling LP, CDs, whatever you want to call it, of all time. Yeah. No, he'll pop up a few more times during the time we've got together. Just some of the names of people that were regulars that you talk about in the book: Andy Warhol, Calvin Klein, a young Brooke Shields. Matter of fact, we've got a shot here of. I think it's probably from when Steve and Ian owned it. Liza Minnelli, she kind of looks like she's in her New York garb, with Mikhail Baryshnikov out on the dance floor. So that she was another one that was there an awful lot. David Geffen, Cary Grant, Jack Nicholson, Paul Simon, John Belushi. Without sounding crass about a lot of these folks, were some of them that later left us too early, or that met early demise due to excesses, were they a certain they talk about type A, type B people. Were they just people that you look back in retrospect and just say, this was like lighting a powder keg under these folks by going to that club all the time?
Well, I haven't thought about it that way.
Yeah.
But,
I mean, not that it was your fault. I'm not implying that. Otherwise,
maybe it was.
It was their decision to go there, or going back to when Ian and Steve owned it. But I mean, clearly from some of the tales that you talk about in the book, I mean, some of these folks that were just like. I don't know. I've never been in a situation where there was that kind of antics going on, and I'm using a toned down word for them, not for you. You were running a business, you were trying to make everybody comfortable, but it's unfortunate how many of these folks that should still be with us, have long gone.
Well, some people overdid it,
yeah.
And we had an informal club that was called the Dawn Patrol, which I write about. And what would happen is people would come around 3:30, 4 in the morning because people just stayed up all night. And we had to close because our liquor license said we couldn't serve liquor after 4, so we closed by 5. And many people didn't want to go home. They didn't want to go sleep. So they hung out in my office sometimes and just got high and wild and told stories, or we would have some limousines outside that would take us to what is now the meatpacking district, where all the clubs are. But that's this century.
Yeah, exactly.
In 1981, 82, 83, these were all boarded up buildings, and the whole area was closed, and all of a sudden we would drive down the street and you'd see a doorman out in front and open the door, and there'd be thousands of people dancing all night. When I say all night, I mean starting at 3 a.m. and going till noon the next day. And I would bring a bunch of people there, and we would move through the crowd and go into the VIP rooms on the second or third floor and just stay high all night, and leave at around 10 in the morning, and all of a sudden we'd be rubbing our eyes because the sunlight would hit us, and we came in the middle of the night, and we would leave. People were running to work, and we'd be going to crash breakfast and then crash at home. Wow,
it's to do that night after night. That's amazing that you came through to the other side in many ways. We've got a photo here. I wanted to go back to Roy Cohn for a second because a lot of people don't know, because Roy's been gone for about 3 decades. But here's a gentleman that. I look at him and what he did, good, bad, or indifferent, as a lawyer, et cetera, and I just think, some of what's going on today, I almost have to wonder how Roy would have looked at what's going on, because, of course, Donald Trump was a protege in many ways of Roy Cohn, kind of a ruthless type. How did you find him to deal with?
I thought he was great. And the people who liked him loved him, and the people who hated him hated him. And he scared the shit out of people. But he would sue anybody for anything, and he'd often win. And he was unscrupulous, and he's Donald Trump's mentor. Exactly. And we hear about him all the time. Yeah, indeed. It's hard to believe. Yeah. We got a shot here of, let's see, you at, it might have been before the Broadway show she was in. I know Raquel Welch on the left, actually Steve Rubell there, and then a shot of you on the right. I'm going to assume that might have been either during your early tenure as owner, or it might have been one of your trips before you bought the club. But again, big Hollywood A-listers, Broadway types, you name it, anybody that was anybody. Even politicians. I saw a shot. Betty Ford was at your place. I mean, but it was interesting. The club originally opened up during the A-Beam mayoral administration.
I was kind of surprised to hear that when Ed Koch became mayor for quite a long time, that at least it comes out in the book like he wasn't a big fan that the club was around. I would have thought, given the renaissance that New York took on in the 80s and 90s, that he would have been very happy to have a club like that drawing the people that it did.
You would think so, but Ed Koch was a funny kind of guy, and he just didn't like the club, didn't like the scene, didn't like the club, and it didn't matter because, you know, we weren't seeking anything from the city. But I recall he was there once for an afternoon event that we had featuring Central Park and veterans. And I can't remember exactly what the story was, but he came and he really had a good time. And that was the first time I had met him. And he told me he really didn't like the club up until that day. I don't know what happened after that. And he had no effect.
Indeed. Photo of Liza Minnelli, and I hope I'm getting it right. It's either Halston or Calvin Klein. It's terrible. You would think I'd know them because, of course, growing up, I used to see these folks all the time. But anyway, I know that's for sure that's Liza. And again, Liza was, certainly frequented. Her sister did. I mean, her husband did.
Probably Halston.
Halston, indeed, with a cigarette in his hand, yeah. And he certainly maximized, from reading the book, he maximized his influence and career aspirations by being quite a regular at your club back in those days.
He did,
yeah.
And so did a lot of people. It became a place to be seen and to meet others and be seen and be photographed with famous people, and a lot of careers started at Studio 54.
Some more names, again, the past and present: Andy Warhol, Bianca Jagger, Farrah Fawcett with Ryan O'Neal, Truman Capote, Liz Taylor, Gene Simmons, all the Kiss gang, the Stones, I mean, Mick and Keith and Ron Wood, otherwise known as the Regulars, and then later, when you took over, those folks that were still around continued, and then you had a whole new crop of 80s people. You mentioned Michael, of course, was performing there. Prince, a young Madonna was one of the first times she debuted really anywhere of notoriety was at your place. Ellen Barkin, Steven Tyler, Ben Stiller, Heather Locklear. How did Drew Barrymore get in there? She looked like she was about 10.
She got in. Everybody dressed up and they wore lipstick and they got in. And the drinking age was 18 in New York. And a lot of 12 and 13-year-olds.
I was gonna say, yeah, she didn't look 14. Let me tell you. Now, you used to have a dance floor. We're looking at a photo here. Another young lady in those days that really seemed to enjoy herself immensely. Diana Ross. On top of the dance floor. And for those youngsters who don't realize, if you look in the bottom right of the photo, in those days it was CD. There wasn't CDs. It was 45s, disco, 12-inch LPs, et cetera, et cetera. So God help if someone shook the table, you'd have a lot of jumping going around. But she looks like she's having the time of her life.
She used to. She had gotten married, and she didn't go out during the 80s when I owned the club, so I didn't experience Diana Ross.
Yeah,
everybody else.
Yeah, that was
the Stones were there all the time.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The stories of Mick down in the basement, in your office, the rubber room. I mean, anywhere there was somewhere to kind of get away from the main dance floor. That certainly was it. I love the quote, Timothy Leary, famous individual for those who might remember him. He was standing like Diana was here on top of the DJ booth yelling, quote, "This is the center of the universe. What a night." So obviously you made big points with that gentleman because, he was quite a character.
Yeah, he was very high that day. On Special K, which was one of the drugs that was around at the time.
Now, looking back at, because you talk in the book about you had been, doing some drugs of some kind, not quite to that level later on, but I'm saying, was that just part of like that New York scene, or was that just in other words, you look back at it now and say to yourself, geez, I was maybe, not out of control, but working my way slowly up to a certain point where you couldn't return?
Well, I didn't realize it at the time, but I probably was. And I didn't think anything was happening or anything was wrong, but there was a lot wrong. And if you do enough illegal illicit drugs, you'll get caught in the web, and eventually you can crash. And I crashed. I crashed in 1984, 85, and that's when I ended up at the Betty Ford Center and stopped doing drugs altogether.
Right, and that was
many years.
That was the first phase, and then as you talked earlier, and we'll talk a little bit about more when then you went to the more spiritual location that you went to. That really kind of put you over the edge in a good way, kind of to your recovery. It's a quote from Gene Simmons, who I've always thought certainly doesn't pass up too many parties. Quote, once upon a time in New York City, when the city finally went to sleep, some would argue that, a magical place opened its doors and invited people to have the times of their lives.
Many people did go to sleep.
Yes. Studio 54 was a magical place that made you forget all about your troubles, trials, and tribulations. It was heaven on earth, unquote. Here's a gentleman who survived not only Studio 54, but fame in general, Gene Simmons, of course, a longtime founder of KISS. But he just seems like a different kind of makeup. I could picture him as, never have met the man, but just someone who would know when to put the brakes on, if you know what I mean.
He didn't get stoned or completely out of it.
Yeah.
He went on and had a great career. He lives out here, and he's opened a small chain of restaurants, and he's got a lot of things going on in his life.
We're looking at a photo here on the left, Farrah Fawcett, the legendary Cary Grant. There goes Cary and Margot Hemingway. And then we've got a shot here of Sly Stallone during the Rocky days, along with pop artist Andy Warhol, the late Andy Warhol, and another young lady who's still with us today, Susan Anton, who I guess in those days was dating Sly. And again, just of the folks that have left us, I know we'll talk a little bit about your friend Rick James, but give me two or three that you say, boy, not only do I miss them, but what good people that they were, and that it's a shame that they maybe left a little sooner than they should have.
Robin Williams was really wonderful, warm, friendly, fabulous. Rick James, of course. Rick was a great guy. People didn't realize, and he just overdid his life, and unfortunately, he's not with us anymore. Who else?
I mean, again, a lot of those folks, again, not to give the impression that they were all, in other words, abusers. But again, I'll give you, for instance, a gentleman who came after your tenure there, a guy like a Chris Farley. A Chris Farley, that would have been like dynamite and a match, at a place like that, because, he just partied hard. Like many people that I've never even witnessed, but somebody like that who came much later. Again, you talk in the book too, without naming names, although I was going to look it up in process of elimination. You had an Academy Award winner there that locked himself up in a room with a bunch of champagne. I mean, you had great stories in there about Tony Curtis, who of course was well known to. In addition to being a good actor, a great artist, a painter, that is, had his issues. And I was surprised Jack Lemmon. I didn't realize he had an issue.
Yeah, Jack did.
Yeah. Now tell me a little bit about when you were with Rick James. A couple of things that come to mind with Rick was, first of all, I didn't know he was on the scene as long as he was. I was amazed to find out, according to your book, that he claims that had it not been for a cold in 1969, that he would have been at the scene of the Sharon Tate murder.
I didn't realize myself.
Yeah, that was incredible. I mean, I didn't know he went back that far with, as a musician, of course, because he really hit it big in the late 70s, early 80s. Rick James, for those of you who don't remember, Super Freak, among many other songs. And we've got a shot here of Rick on the left, along with Mark Fleishman, our guest here for the hour on Studio 411. Name of the book, Inside Studio 54, published by Rare Bird Books. For more information, www.rarebirdbooks.com. Another thing, too, is this might be a little tricky to talk about. It was a story in there that he would hook up with quite a few people at the club. Would you say that was an accurate statement?
Rick?
Yes.
Very accurate.
Yeah.
He hooked up all the time. By the way, you keep mentioning Rare Bird Books, but
yes.
If people want to buy the book, Amazon.com makes the best deal.
Very good, very good. There's a photo that I found of a particular individual. I don't know that we're going to really talk about it, but would it be safe to say that he hooked up with someone who might have been involved with an exorcist, if you get my drift? I'm not sure he's...
Yeah, you can mention
there you go, here you go, yeah.
Linda Blair.
There you go, okay, yeah, from his lips, not
Linda
mine.
Blair, and they had quite an affair going on.
Yeah.
Also hooked up with Janice Dickinson, who's a famous model, and he hooked up with a lot of women.
And she was in the news recently, too, because I believe she was also one of the many women that was... saying that she had been, mishandled by a certain well-known comedian who's still around today. But I do recall that, and she very, very attractive. Got a shot here from back in the day of Elton John back in his youth, along with Olivia Newton-John. And there was one, I think, probably from Steve and Ian's day of Olivia and John Travolta. I don't know. I thought they were just platonic. I got the feeling there was a little more to that, but I guess we'll have to try to get one of them on to get to the bottom of that story. You had people like, again, Andy Warhol, Divine. I mean, just you name it. It was amazing. If the world could get along as well as the diverse people that were in that club without the drugs, we'd be a better world.
I agree.
It just...
people really had a good time, and they really loved each other, and everybody was hugging and kissing, and it was a good scene.
Exactly, and not everybody was, looking to necessarily pick everybody up. You know what I'm saying? It was kind of a thing, just like you said, to hang out and get away from it all. And as I said, that's why I think with the advent of modern technology and social media today, I think it would be hard pressed to recreate those days. Although I do understand recently, I don't know, it might have been a couple of years ago, they did reopen the club in its current form. I thought it was being used as a theatrical venue now, but you did make a return trip to your old stomping grounds for a benefit party?
It is a theater now.
Yeah.
But when the Studio 54 station on Sirius Radio opened, they had a party at Studio 54, and it was an amazing party. They had to take out some of the theater seats to make room for it, but and the old bar wasn't there anymore. The bar that everybody hung out at. But it was quite a night.
How did it feel to be back there? Kind of brought back a lot of good memories.
It felt good, and I reconnected with some of my employees, and one was Denise Shatman, who is a contributor to the book, and along with my wife, Mimi
Fleishman,
married at the time to Jerry Rubin during those days.
Now that was the Jerry Rubin of the Abby Hoffman, that whole kind of
right, the Abby Hoffman, Jerry Rubin.
Yeah, radical clique, kind of protesters, for lack of a better term. Yeah. Yeah, so Mimi was married to him. I got you. Yeah, and I understand he was.
And they got divorced,
Yeah.
and then I married her.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, and
I
actually,
always had a crush on her.
yeah. Well, you were lucid enough to notice her, which that's a good thing. So that means you were in more control than you give yourself credit for. Now, some folks here to my left that look like they're having a good old time. On the left, we've got Keith Richards and kind of that perpetual look that Keith always has, and the other two were Tina Turner and David Bowie. And then here we've got a picture of you on the bottom left with Lorna Luft, Liza Minnelli's half-sister, Judy Garland's other daughter, along with a gentleman named George Martin, who I don't know is not the George Martin of Beatles fame, but someone else that you hung out with, and also another Stone, Ron Wood. Here's a gentleman.
I know that picture.
Yeah, Ron Wood will outlive us all. I'm convinced of that.
Yeah, Ron is an amazing person, and he's a great artist, and also he's a great guitar player.
Absolutely.
Bass player.
With the Stones for many years, and those of you old enough to remember before that was with the band Faces, which was headed up by Rod Stewart. A little trivia for our viewers. New York Magazine back in 2003 did a cover story, 100 years of New York's hottest scenes, of which Studio 54, Small's Paradise, and the Copacabana were featured in the top 10. So to those of you that owned it during the short-lived time it was open, kudos to you guys, because obviously it made an impression, continues from a historical standpoint to still make an impression after all these years.
I remember that cover story in New York Magazine, and it's amazing that they picked up Small's Paradise, which to me was, way out of the mainstream, but I loved it there.
See, I would have thought like Sardi's or some other place, but maybe those were more like food type of places, or the Brown Derby, or Max Schmeling had a club, it was more of an eatery, but still, that people used to hang out with, or again, maybe they were sticking with just Manhattan, because of course then you had all your folk clubs back in the 50s and 60s. So again, a lot of historical places to go have a good meal or hang out and see celebrities. Another shot of Rod Stewart. I believe it's Alana Stewart, who he was with or married to later on, as well as another shot of Elton. So Elton liked hanging out at the club too. And then later on, when you came on, you had folks start to perform there as well. That must have been a kick for the patrons.
It was. We had a lot of live performances, the Temptations, and
Four Tops. I know there's a great story in there about the Tops, and the Stones came in, and there was all sorts of shenanigans going on there. But just great. And Madonna, as we said earlier, she was there very early on in her career. And you mentioned Michael. I mean, with the big screen doing Thriller. I mean, that was just people must have been going crazy watching these folks. It's a shame that I could have envisioned like having almost like a syndicated show, like where it would have been, live from Studio 54. You know what I'm saying? And could have
could have done that.
Yeah, I know you had a magazine for a while, but from a TV standpoint, as I read the book, I thought, my goodness, the folks that could have just literally
what a show that would have been.
They would have just hopped up on stage almost impromptu with a house band, and you would have had like a hit show, on television or cable in those days. Another shot of Andy Warhol and the infamous Divine. Again, for those of you who remember Pink Flamingos and the original Hairspray, John Waters and company. I didn't see John Waters there, but there were so many people that, again, we just didn't have images of. But again, it would almost be easier for me to say who didn't go to Studio 54. Is there one or two people that you thought to yourself, I never got that person to come to my club?
Well, like I told you, Diana Ross didn't come during the 4 years that I owned it.
Right.
And John Waters lived in, I knew John from I was partners in a company called New Line Cinema, which distributed Female Troubles and Pink Flamingos and a lot of the Divine movies. And he was in Baltimore and never came to the club.
Wow, amazing.
Everybody else came.
Oh yeah, I mean, you had people, news people, you know, politicians. I mean, it just boggles the mind at the folks. You know, anybody. Here's a shot here from during your tenure. I quite envy the man, Eddie Murphy and Jamie Lee Curtis, kind of hanging out together. That's quite a
combination.
Yes, quite a combination indeed. Eddie and the rest of the Saturday Night Live gang, which again, you had some partiers in that bunch for sure. Tell me, give me like a couple of songs that come to mind when you hear them, either because they performed there or you just remember the music fondly, that when you hear it on the radio or on your iPod or Spotify, that instantly takes you back to those days when you owned Studio 54.
The song "Le Freak" by Chic, you know, which was written about Studio 54. One of the members of Chic couldn't get in, and the song started "Freak Out" or.
Yes, Freak Out, yeah,
like
exactly, yeah.
But they changed it to "Le Freak."
Oh, Le Freak, I got it, I got you. There you go.
And you know, and the big line there is "Come on down to 54." That's a major song.
Yeah.
And the Donna Summer songs and.
Now, did Donna ever come to the club during your time there?
She was there once or twice.
Yeah, yeah.
Never performed there.
Yeah, I was going to say, back to Rick James briefly. Did Rick ever get up and do any numbers?
He never performed, but he was always in the middle of every scene in the world. And so when he walked into the club with his entourage, the DJs would play his music, and he would get up on a platform and just...
Oh, kind of lip sync. Yep. I got you. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, something like that.
Here's another.
And, of course, Madonna, before she was famous, performed doing the song "Holiday," which we broke for her, and it became a major hit after that.
And as we wind down the hour with Mark Fleishman, author of Inside Studio 54, another shot of Michael, quite with a young Bruce Jenner on the extreme left, and then Valerie Perrine, what looks like Jane Fonda. And in between them, looking very comfortable there, must be the Indian and the rest of the crew from the Village People, along with Michael Jackson. So again, anyone who was anyone, except for a couple that we've mentioned, went to Studio 54. Mark, again, just a wonderful book. I look forward to any further work from you. A quick quote. From Nile Rodgers, Rock and Roll Hall of Famer, a producer, songwriter for Chic. Inside Studio 51 takes you to all my favorite spots inside. I spent so much time snorting cocaine in the women's toilets, and they became known as my office. So there you go. There we go. I don't know how much more honest we can be about that for sure. And we have a shot here that I promised. On the left, we have Denise Chapman. A co-author with Mark on the book, and his lovely wife Mimi. Again, both, especially right and left, both pillars to you, and I'm sure big help and big critics with you putting this book together.
Well, thank you very much. Absolutely.
Very good. All right, you hang in there with us. Again, we thank Mark for joining us here on this episode of Studio 411. I never confuse the two studios. As I said, ours needs a disco ball or something, but it's not quite a Studio 54. We thank those of you for watching. Again, the book Inside Studio 54, Rare Bird Books. For more information, rarebirdbooks.com. And we look forward to having you on next time on Studio 411. Take care.